former IAS officer, social activist, author, and one might add, the conscience keeper of the nation. I think that would succinctly sum up the credentials of Mr. Harsh Mander. He has published several books based on his experiences with working for the marginalized to remind us that we live happily in a terribly unjust world. Mr. Harsh Mander is currently in town to participate in the Hyderabad Literary Festival, and we have taken this opportunity to invite him to our studios. So, welcome to our studios, Mr. Mander, and thank you so much for taking the time off.
My pleasure. Thanks.
I'll begin by asking you, now you come from the prestigious Indian Administrative Services, which is the steel framework of India. Would you agree with me if I said that this is a colonial legacy which was created more to rule than to serve?
I often think about why we chose to continue with the Indian Administrative Service, almost unchanged in its not in its structure, but also the ethos of those large colonial homes and a lot of display of power. And I think that the reason was primarily because we had the context of partition, and that the country was being torn apart. And when Sardar Patel said that the Indian Administrative Service would be the steel frame, I think the expectation was that for a long time we might have political parties which try to exploit differences in religious identity and divide people on the basis of caste and language and religion. And it would be this civil service which would stand tall and hold the nation together. I think the emergency was a moment when we saw the civil service going completely on its knees, and after that, in terms of communal violence, you had the 84 riots in Delhi, and then you had a series after that. You had Bhagalpur, you had the Bombay riots after the Babri Masjid demolition itself.
Yes.
And then you had the Gujarat violence in 2002. And even after that, you see a civil service which actually, far from standing up and standing tall, has willingly allowed itself to be part of the political communal agenda of particular.
You resigned as from the services in protest after the 2002 riots. Some would say that you would have done greater. I mean, it would have helped if you had stayed on. People like you had stayed on to fight, on behalf of the government.
I loved the years that I spent in the civil service. I worked for 17, 18 years as part of the civil service in remote areas, largely of Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. And there's hardly a job like it, especially for a young person, to be able to make a difference to people's lives, to implement your beliefs, because this, especially on the ground, you can implement land reforms, you can work for the most marginalized, you can protect tribal communities, and there's a great deal that you can do. Also during communal riots, to be fair. So I saw all of that, and I loved the years that I spent. But 2002 was a moment when, which came, I had seen this decline that we spoke about a little earlier, where I think we had a purpose if we were defending India's secular democratic constitution at all costs. But when we saw something like Gujarat, where once I went there and I saw that across almost 20 districts, you saw violence of the most brutal kind, largely targeting women and children, and that it was enabled by the state, and the civil servants allowed, because this much I have seen through my own handling of communal violence and whatever I have observed and studied, that no riot can actually go on for even a few hours, let alone 24 hours.
Without the connivance of...
Without the active connivance of the state. And this, Gujarat continued across this very wide area with really unbelievable cruelty for weeks. And it was at that moment when I felt that I needed to firstly say, so I wrote a piece as a serving IAS officer called Cry, My Beloved Country, where I talked about this being not a riot but a state-sponsored massacre. And I thought it would be a voice in the wilderness, but somehow it resonated, and this was long before things became viral on internet, etc. But it just went around all over India and the world. And I expressed my anguish, and then the Times of India published it, and that was within about 15 days or so of violence. And I then realized that there are many battles that you can fight from within the system, but this was a battle to defend, in my understanding, India's constitutional values themselves. And this was one battle I felt that I needed to stand independently and outside government.
But you were in service much before that, and then you must have seen other riots. So what was that which was so different from other riots? What was that different about the Gujarat riots?
See, I think that between 84 riots, and there's a continuity.
Yes.
84 riots, I was actually posted as an additional collector as a very young officer in Indore, where we also saw this breaking out of, and as a young civil servant, I didn't dream that I would see that kind of cruelty that was being meted out. But I remembered what I had learned from in the academy, and that the senior most magistrate on the spot has the right to call in the army. You don't have to ask anybody. And I understood that this was again a state sponsored massacre, the first that we really saw. But I decided I'd call in the army, and the general was actually waiting. He said, "Are you prepared to put in writing?" I said, "Sure." And I called in the army. I ordered shoot at sight, and we were able to completely control a massive riot. And this was start to finish just about 6 hours. And so I saw what was possible, and I understood it from within. I mean, even in Gujarat itself, there was a district where there was a police officer called Rahul Sharma, and he decided that he would not, and so that exception actually, and he controlled the riot because he used force, he was fair, and he was compassionate, and he was able to control the violence. And I think that further demonstrated the enormity of the failure where that didn't happen.
You've written several books, all of them very, very moving, I should say. Based on your experiences with the marginalized, with the traumatized. So they're very moving, very touching, very haunting, I should say. And it's like as if you're trying to shake people up, and tell them don't, like your title says, don't look away.
Right.
They're looking away. But do you think it's making any difference? Because I literally count on the fingers of one hand people like you, people who are trying to make a difference, people in some position of power and influence. So do you think it will make any difference at all?
I think, I think we've lost in public life today, in our social relations, we've lost the sense of caring and belonging with each other. We've lost an outrage of justice. People of privilege, as I have said in my book, have completely look away. We see the greatest injustice just before our eyes, and we've developed this extraordinary capacity to look away.
Absence of outrage is your term.
The absence of outrage. If we look back on the constitution that we the people gave to ourselves, a constitution, and there were 4 pillars. I think we remember sometimes the other 3 pillars, which are justice, liberty, and equality. But what we least remember is the 4th, which is fraternity. And fraternity is a word that that people don't really understand. The Hindi word for it, and I think it might have a resonance even in Telugu,
Bhaichara.
is bandhuta.
Bandhuta, okay.
Bandhuta. It's a really lovely word. It's basically this idea of bandhu is actually both friend, but it's also being bound together in Sanskrit. And so the idea that we are bound to each other, that if a child is sleeping on the streets and I come home, I just see the child, likely to be raped in the night and sleeping hungry, found her food in a rubbish heap somewhere. And it doesn't matter to me. I come home and I put my own daughter to bed with every protection that life can give. I think it is that, and the distance, physical distance between those children may be just maybe a kilometer, but it becomes the longest distance in the world. And I think it is, what I do believe is this sense of, is trying to restore the idea of compassion in public life, and that I have felt, more the idea of empathy. And so a lot of my writing is built around the notion of empathy, of caring. And I've found it interesting that, not just in India, but if you look at the American elections recently, on the one hand you have a leader like Donald Trump, who in many ways represents a trend actually across many countries in the world. Our own Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and people in the Brexit in the UK, France,
Philippines, Turkey.
And Turkey, etc. We're seeing a very, very assertive, aggressive.
The rise of right-wing extremism.
The right-wing extremism, both in terms of, the opposition to a welfare developmental state.
Exactly.
But also an open hostility against minorities. And hostility against minorities, a hostility even against the poor. And in that context, I found it interesting that somebody like Bernie Sanders, for instance, who people would have, hardly thought he's 10 years older even than I am, and even less charismatic as a speaker, and he became like a rock star for young people. And if you listen carefully to his speeches, he's largely talking about restoring compassion. That we all
you use
care
this
and
term
belong.
sanctioned inequality.
Yes, yes.
Which I thought was very true.
Inequality will persist to this degree only, in fact, Ela Bhatt somewhere said that poverty is violence sanctioned
by the government.
And by the people. I'm not just talking about the government. I think that, for instance, I was part of drafting the Food Security Act. And when it was being actually debated in Parliament, I was in television studios repeatedly. And I remember this very well-known industrialist, I won't mention the name, was very angry. Everybody was angry. And this person said, I made my money, I worked hard, I've done nothing to harm the economy. Why should I be taxed to feed the poor? And at some core level, I think she raised this very fundamental question. Why should I be taxed to feed the poor? So I said, I'm sorry, the poor work much harder. They've done even less to harm the economy. And in a good society, people of wealth should be prepared to share
some of it.
Share some of it in a redistributive way to ensure a life of dignity to people. And I do think, there's strong economic grounds as well for investing much more in good quality education for every child, for healthcare, for social protection, because if half young people who are entering the workforce are poorly nourished, are poorly educated, we're losing economically quite substantially. But I think there's a deeper moral question that we're talking about. And when Rohit Vemula, right in this city, exactly a year ago, in fact, when he took his life, he made that, in that letter he said, I could not escape the fatal accident of my birth.
Birth.
I felt that in some ways it's the most powerful and moving indictment of all that we are as a society and as a country and as a state, because the fact that for millions of people it is the accident of birth which continues to trap them.
Exactly.
You know, the accident of where you're born determines whether you'll survive at all, whether you'll whether you'll have decent nutrition, whether you'll have a proper roof over your head, whether you'll be able to study, how far you'll be able to study, what quality of education you'll have, what kind of jobs and opportunities are open to you. None of this is determined by by the qualities of your heart and mind and character and hard work and the flight of your dreams. It's determined very, very substantially by the accident of birth. And for those of us for whom the accident of birth has been favourable.
Basically what people think is that, welfare and subsidies, they are like versus development.
Yes. Yeah.
So both of them are mutually exclusive. And the left parties, for some reason, across the world and more so in India, I see a complete decline. They are not able to reinvent themselves to meet this challenge from the right wing.
Yeah. I think that that's why I feel a discourse which combines a discussion about justice and compassion, to my mind, is important. I feel that we're primarily talking about justice, but talking about justice without caring, but equally talking about compassion without a sense of justice. And I think that we have to have a new discourse which combines both of these. But also this notion that that there is in some way a conflict between the aims of growth and the aims of equity and justice, I feel is a completely false dichotomy. Very strong understanding is that if, after all, India is supposed to be going through what is called the demographic dividend. We have the largest proportion of young people in the world. Every second Indian is below the age of 25. And so we have a very large workforce, a very small proportionately dependent force of older people and very young people. And this is supposed to be great for the economy, but we are not investing in our greatest resource, which is our own people. Also, this mode of economic growth is actually not yielding jobs. The argument was that let the state is corrupt, let it withdraw, let the market function, and the market will create so much growth and it will create jobs. And then because everyone will have more work, will earn more money, they will be able to buy their health and education and social protection in the market, and the state need not do anything. This was the argument that we were told 25 years ago. Today we see that wealth certainly has been created. We've had India is the fastest growing economy in the world. We've got massive increases of wealth. But it's very unequally distributed wealth. But I think that many people still don't understand, and I believe that perhaps that is the world's great crisis and why we are moving so much to the right, is that we're not creating jobs.
I read somewhere that way back when you were a student at St. Stephen's, you had a lot of, you said that a lot of your friends then were all left-leaning.
Yes.
And today some of them are in the BJP.
Yeah, sure.
What do you think happens over the years? They get wiser, or they get more selfish and think about themselves?
It's an interesting question, because when I was growing up, actually, most of us, and in an elite college like St. Stephen's, most of us were actually some kind of left. So your discussion was which kind of left, and my more humanistic kind of left was not seen by many as radical enough. And today I'm more or less in the same politics, and I'm seen like I'm some extreme left loony, because the world has moved so much more rightwards. I do believe that we went through, at that in the 60s, 70s, we believed that a more just and humane world was possible, and we would be part of that process of making that happen. It would happen now in our lifetimes. I think the whole failure of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the entire disillusionment that happened around it there were very good reasons for the Soviet Union to collapse, because you were trying to build the most just and humane society by the most unjust and repressive means, and it collapsed. But instead of understanding that it was that experiment to build a just and humane society that failed, the ideas of justice themselves, the ideas of equality, the ideas of compassionate society,
they were trashed.
They were trashed. And we were told that greed is good, that you should just think about yourself. And the whole neoliberal idea with Margaret Thatcher and
capitalism is the only thing that works.
And very selfish, self-seeking capitalism.
Most often you find that people who are left-leaning in their thinking and what they advocate, they're immediately branded as Naxal-friendly, or promoting Maoism or Naxalism or something. But you have made one, I like that term which you said. You said you don't condone even altruistic violence.
Yes.
So
I've been, very, in fact, my critics, and there are many, especially after 2002, so I'm continuously being attacked for my belief in secular values is one kind of attack, but your belief in redistributive just welfare state is seen also as as evidence of your being a Maoist. And at the very senior-most leaders of this country in public discussions have actually described me as a Maoist. And I find that absurd in many ways, because I'm passionately against all forms of violence. I believe that the idea that in order to build a compassionate, rebuild a compassionate society, I will use means that are brutal, is doomed to failure, because and we've seen this repeatedly with each of the movements, the Maoist movements, for instance, ultimately get brutalized in the process of those battles. And I think that I'm convinced that you have to fight, you have to resist, you have to sacrifice, but a battle that is built around violence ultimately gets brutalized and turns against itself.
Would you tell us a little about the NGOs that you're involved with?
I do a lot of different kinds of work, and people find that. So, apart from my writing and documentation of the world as I see it, I work firstly with people affected by communal violence. I work with in many sites. So we worked for many years in Gujarat, and also now in older sites like Bhagalpur, but newer sites, Assam, Muzaffarnagar, with the 84 riot victims. So that's one segment of my work. It comes largely under the rubric of what we call Aman Biradri. Then we started this work with street children, and in fact Hyderabad has been the place where we've had the greatest success. The idea is actually to convert government schools into residential spaces for homeless children, because you have even Hyderabad, for instance, would have about 30,000 homeless children who sleep on the streets, and 16-18 hours a day actually a school is empty, and those are the hours when a child is most vulnerable. So and there's no way you can take care of street children without having large numbers of residential spaces in urban areas. And so we thought that probably the best way to do it is actually to just refurbish and open up
these unused spaces.
The schools, and during school hours those children will do their bridge schooling, and the rest of the time they have the whole campus. It's a very low cost, and it humanizes society, it humanizes, and the fact these children are together with children with families and homes, and that they learn from each other, because our children also have a lot of strength. So this idea,
they come into the mainstream.
They come and the mainstream children learn also courage and spirit and many things from our children. So so this started off as an idea. Sister Cyril had started this firstly in Loreto. I thought let's do it in large scale in government. We fought initially. This seemed like an idea that wouldn't work, but it's worked. We now have about 46 such residential schools across the country in about 8 cities. I've now formally stepped back from that and created an organization called Rainbow Foundation. India chairperson is Shanta Sinha. Also was commissioner appointed by the Supreme Court for the right to food. This is basically to ensure that governments are doing enough to prevent hunger and so on.
Starvation.
Starvation. So I do a lot of that. So those are the range of things. I'm also director of something called the Center for Equity Studies with equality. So we bring out a report called the India Exclusion Report every year, where we're trying to talk about public policy from the perspective of equity. So those are some of the things I do.
Wonderful work,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Mander, and
Thank
I really hope and pray that you're able to influence at least the youngsters who are coming out of college. I think maybe you lead a way to a more humane society. I really hope and pray that it happens.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for being with us
Thank
today.
you, Sunita.